and Tim's from the university, so there's a lot of long words in his bio, so I'll read them out if you don't mind. He specialises in transportation infrastructure and urban modelling. Much of his research is applied with a focus on equity and climate change, and his past work includes evaluating the efficacy of policies aimed at mitigating climate change. And I also noticed that, like me, Tim has an LLB. So this is obviously something that's really essential if you're really keen on the environment. Just be a lawyer. Tim, you have the floor.
Okay, well that looks, thank you for the introduction. Yeah, so my name's Tim Welch. I am a senior lecturer at the University of Auckland. I have a few other titles: Director of the Urban Planning Program there, Co-Director of the Future Cities Research Hub. You'll notice I'm not a native Kiwi, that's pretty obvious, every time I start speaking. But I'm originally from well, I've been all over the United States, but my climate work started, well, I may have a youthful face, but over 20 years ago, when I was working in Florida, and as a graduate student there, we'd been hit pretty hard by a number of hurricanes. Cyclones are hurricanes in the northern hemisphere. And we worked with the Federal Emergency Management Agency to start to develop what we call hazard mitigation plans. A lot of that was how do people fortify the places they live, make them stronger against storms, and also starting a really hard conversation about should we be living in these locations anymore. From there, I got a PhD at the University of Maryland, where I worked on climate action planning, so building plans for cities and countries to better adapt to the climate that was to come and to mitigate climate change to some degree. I worked at Georgia Tech in the States for about a decade, teaching urban planning and civil engineering. There I also worked on a big project where we developed the first climate action plan in Mexico, for Guadalajara, Mexico. As a federal law there, they have to have local climate action plans. And we helped them develop the first one, and also started work on restoring the biggest natural lake there, Lake Chapala. And then from there, I've been here in Auckland a few years, and so trying to adapt some of the stuff that we talk about in many other countries to what's happening in New Zealand. And really a lot of the stuff, the problems we face here are very similar to the things we talk about in other locations, and obviously climate change is a global issue, so it's somewhat applicable. So moving on, so this is a graphic that's been sent to me a few times. I tried to track down the original cartoonist, I guess you'd call them, the person that created this image, but it's attributed to a number of people, so I didn't give an attribution, but I left the original Spanish on here, which is essentially just saying that the floodplain is meant to allow a river to fill, to expand, and then to move on. But when we start to fill in the floodplain or develop the floodplain, that's when we open ourselves up to inundation and flooding. So in a fairly simple graphic, this explains a lot of the things that we've experienced in the last few months. So what have we done? One of the things that we've done, and unfortunately I will talk a little bit about what we should not do. It won't be all positive. But this is the Wairau Valley here on the North Shore. And you can see here, this is the 1940s satellite imagery. And overlaid here are the floodplains that have been around for a long time. And you can see that in the 40s, they're pretty mindful of where to develop, conscious of those floodplains. As we move forward in time, 1960s, we start to ignore those floodplains. A lot of what we do is fill in the low spots or culvert big streams. So there's the Wairau stream that goes out to Milford, and along this kind of floodplain here. And so that goes all underground. By the 1980s, basically we've ignored every floodplain and developed pretty heavily in this location. And then moving into today, it's as if the floodplains never existed. And again, all that water that used to be surface water is all underground and what we call culverted, put in pipes and cement underground. And so when we get a lot of rain, our engineered cities, so everything that's meant to transport all this flood water that runs off of buildings and pavement, all gets channeled into the central location. These streams that were meant to handle essentially runoff from 40, 50, 60 years ago. We have more extreme events now, and as that higher rainfall comes, it easily overwhelms that old engineered system and results in things like this. And this is the same down the Wire Road there, and then the highway, the pack and save the whole road. This is the floodplain. This is in actual imagery what happened in the floods, the Auckland Day floods, I guess we're calling them now, and then inside the pack and save even. My kids like the idea of taking a canoe through the aisles of the grocery store, but aside from them, it wasn't really a lot of fun for most other people. So if we think about ways that we can be more conscious of the way we've engineered our city, the things we develop, that's one way that we start to build our cities to be more resilient. And we'll go through a few other things. So this is the original 1841 plan for Auckland. It never actually developed this way. This is CBD. This is Albert Park here, so that circle never happened. But these are all original streams and rivers. So this is just a small portion of surface water that used to exist in Auckland. And you can see obviously that we didn't follow this. The current map of Auckland put all of those streams, again, underground, culverted them, and then we rely on a system of drains to move all that water back out to the sea when we face extreme events. So again, we're ignoring these streams and wetlands that have existed for a long time, and in a way have evolved to adapt to our climate, but we're creating a climate that far exceeds that adaptation and then covering over those natural spaces that could have helped us also mitigate the storm. Not to beat up on Kumia too much, but this is it also in the 1940s, so not much there, pretty rural. We move forward, it's a little hard to see I suppose from here, but we move forward to today. Pretty heavy development here. Here's the floodplain over the same today's development. And then the result from 2021 with heavy floodwaters as well. So it's not as if these things aren't predictable. A lot of times our floodplains, we expect them to happen once in 100 years, once in 75 years. That once in a century storm is happening much, much more often. And as a result, we're seeing this flooding and inundation occur much more often. So here's out at Takapuna Beach. You can kind of see how our stormwater systems work. So I'm sure we're all fairly familiar with this, but stormwater is generally untreated, in many cases unfiltered. So we rely on catch basins, those grates that we were just hearing about that often need to be maintained and swept out to carry that water to pipes that were built in the 1950s and 60s. They're often falling apart and then carry that out to the ocean or the sea or the harbor or wherever those pipes may lead. Those pipes easily get overwhelmed when we have even moderate rainfall, and as a result it sometimes will mix with sewage and we'll get that kind of combined stormwater or sewage overflow. And that's why we start to see all the beaches close down fairly rapidly after storms, because this infrastructure just can't handle that amount of rainwater without mixing with other contamination and then going to a place where it's not filtered. So we see all sorts of old infrastructure that's aging, and it's a significant amount of money just to maintain this stuff, let alone replace it. And so we can think of ways that we can replace or at least help make this more efficient or make this older infrastructure last longer by slowing down the burden placed on this infrastructure by preserving wetlands and things like that, which I'll talk about in a minute. Other things we often do is use a lot of engineering to try to solve our development. So not all of this is terrible, but there's better ways to do this. This is what we call gray infrastructure. The pipes we saw before were also called gray infrastructure. But these are kind of rainwater basins. And so they go from kind of the landscaped grassy areas to ones that are very obvious with grates and catch basins to more cemented off areas. And all of this represents a lot of dead space. It's not super efficient in terms of holding water. It is good in allowing that water to filter back into the ground and be treated. But it also is really expensive. So estimates are as high as $30,000 per car park just to allow this type of infrastructure. And the reason we need this kind of infrastructure is because we built so much surface area that's impervious, right? That the water just runs off of, so it has to go somewhere. And the only place that it can go is either into kind of our stormwater system, which isn't up to the task usually, or into these basins, consuming a significant amount of space. All right, some other things. We also have a loss of green infrastructure. So the change in 2012 to the RMA that kind of removed blanket protection of trees was, I guess, a boon to development, but it also came at the cost of a significant loss of tree cover. Estimates put the tree cover loss in Auckland in the last 20 years of about 18%, which may not seem significant, but that can make a difference when it comes to preserving green space, allowing those trees to absorb groundwater quickly. The more groundwater that those trees pull out of the ground, the drier that ground is when it does rain, and the more absorptive power that ground has when we have a storm. So without those trees, we kind of see the consequences of the increased level of flooding. And of course, storms are becoming more frequent and more intense. 2020 was considered the worst every year for claims, insurance claims, due to weather and really climate in a way. I'm sure 2023 will be a close competitor, if not easily surpass that number. And maybe 2022 when those numbers come in as well. We have flooding that was a 1 in 250 year storm recently, and then of course the PM said a few times that Cyclone Gabriel was a once in a century event. And these are things that happen within a couple years, or within a couple weeks, or within a few years of each other. So these long-term events are happening at a much more frequent cycle. And so we should make our cities more resilient to these sorts of events. And so we kind of have this range of ways that we can start to address this, or we think about the problem. So on the far right here is kind of what we do now, right? We engineer everything. And it's not to throw engineers under the bus, it's just the way we've done things normally. We build, we make a development, we build a city, we pave a lot of things, and then we put that stuff in pipes. And that's kind of what our manuals say. That's the way that our plans have been developed for years and years. So it's not that engineers are putting us in this box, but that we put ourselves in this way because this is what we've done for so long. And so there is small movements afoot to move towards this kind of more eco or green infrastructure. So moving from techno gray to a green or eco-based infrastructure. And it starts as simple as things like green roofs. I'll show you some examples in a minute where we don't have to, there's no reason we have to have shingles on our roof or concrete or even black roofs or dark colored roofs. We can put other things up there that are not just attractive but also help reduce stormwater and help with cooling. Things like curbside bioswales, so instead of those kind of catch basins we saw a minute ago and concrete, we can put in natural plants that help capture that water, store that water, make a more attractive environment. Detention basins, not like that one in the picture, but ones that are more attractive and more useful. I'll show you examples in a minute. And of course, the most powerful thing we could do on kind of that scale of eco or green infrastructure is just preserving the wetlands and forests in the first place. Right? So don't cut down the wetlands, don't drain the wetlands, and replace it with a subdivision. There are other ways to go about it. So some of the solutions are things we can do, and there's a few acronyms here, but sustainable drainage systems, I know that doesn't sound super exciting, but the results are pretty interesting. So I rode my bike here from North Shore, and I was on the Oteria stream path, and I noticed it was kind of interesting. They have a number of signs up that talk about stormwater management and different types of infrastructure we can implement. And one of the signs there is talk about permeable surfaces, and I think there's maybe a 1 meter patch of permeable surface there, which is interesting. I mean, the whole thing should probably be permeable. 1 meter is not going to make a big difference. I understand the illustration, but this type of infrastructure, it may seem mundane, but can make a huge difference. So here's an example of a car park that half of it, so the left-hand side is traditional pavement, and they flooded it with a water tank here. And you can see how quickly how much water it retains versus the right-hand side here, which is permeable pavement. So it completely absorbed it like a sponge. It goes through the system, it gets filtered. By the time it hits the water table, the aquifer, or anywhere else it's going, it's been filtered and cleaned, so we're not at risk of flooding our beaches, our seas with contaminated or polluted water. There's a lot of stuff that sits on the surface of pavement that does run into stormwater, so even if it doesn't touch sewage or something else, there's a lot of kind of gross stuff that gets picked up. So tire dust, brake dust, things like that, full of little chemicals that go out into the ocean. In fact, tire dust is considered one of the greatest sources globally for micro plastics that we're finding in abundance in ocean and fish. So that's just getting swept into our stormwater system. But it can be filtered better through different material uses. And it doesn't have to be wide-scale things like this when we plant urban trees and space those pavers, even in places that are lower maintenance, can make a big difference. So this street would not flood likely because it does have a number of different things that have been activated to make that work. Green infrastructure. So if you look at here, this is the Yarra Bend Park in Melbourne. So a little bit a ways from us, but this is an interesting park because they preserved a significant amount of the natural wetlands around the river, the Yarra River, and as a result, it's really reduced the impact of flooding, so that river can flood without impacting nearby development. And it's also created a really cool like urban forest and parkland. So there's kind of that win-win, I'll talk about that in a minute, infrastructure. Some really important things we can do is just preserving suburban trees or planting them in the first place. Often when we see suburban or development plans for whatever type of suburban development, it doesn't often include trees because they're an extra expense, but they can make a big difference in mitigating some stormwater impacts, and urban trees as well. And then this kind of bio-retention or rain gardens along berms. So this is often extra space, unused space in the city. And if you have that extra space, it's a good place to kind of start to build in some of this cool infrastructure. And this can be an attractive location, a kind of a congregation place, or a nice place to look at for people walking along the city. It doesn't have to just be for stormwater. This is, it's a little hard to see I think on the slide, but this is the rooftop garden at the university I used to teach at a few years ago. And so this student building, the whole part of this campus was built on an old stream as well, and then it was just stuck underground. It's an engineering school, so of course they just put the stream underground and built some grass over the top of it. And then this huge building, the student union building, which caused massive amounts of flooding. So they redeveloped the rooftop to include this garden space, and it can actually contain a massive quantity of water and hold that in, and it significantly reduced the amount of flooding in this quad area. And it's also a kind of a focal point for the campus. It's one, anytime people visit the campus, it's one of the first places people are taken. There's been a lot of talk about light rail recently, for better or worse. If you put light rail above ground, you can do things like what we call green tracking. This is where instead of, you don't need pavement, the tracks will be happy as long as there's some infrastructure underneath. But in between the tracks, you don't have to have pavement everywhere. You can plant grass or moss or native plants all around it. And because they don't deviate from this path, you can put trees and other things right down the center where the tracks cross each other. So you have all sorts of different options. You can run them through urban forests. And this can actually, it doesn't seem like much maybe, but it can actually reduce flooding from nearby infrastructure by a significant amount. And this also helps to kind of filter more water and keep these spaces much cooler. And because bikes are much less heavy than cars, you can do lighter weight, cheaper, permeable pavements for bike paths. And so you can have them that are basically very porous and will not retain any water and will act almost like grass itself when you build a bike lane. So it's possible. There's a little more cost in it, but the long-term maintenance often pays off, and the reduction in flooding towards the rest of your stormwater system also helps offset that cost. A lot of this falls under this bigger umbrella of this concept of a sponge city, and this originated with one professor in China about 20 years ago, and China itself has instituted 30 sponge cities around the country, and there's 200 different cities around the world that are working towards implementing these sponge city concepts. And it's really all about preserving as much of the natural environment as you can, making those that are that part of the natural environment that's in an urban space attractive and useful for people, and I'll show you some examples in just a second, and then developing intensely on the locations that you've already developed, right? So if you have an urban space, try to push development towards those locations so you're not putting development pressure on those more sensitive wetland areas or floodplains or things like that. And a lot of it is also about looking forward in time. So we may get intense rains one week, but it can be dry for weeks and weeks afterwards. So if you do things like preserve or catch that rainwater when it's happening, you can use that to water lawns, to water plants. You can do all sorts of other things than just flushing that water out to sea. Okay? So that's kind of that general concept of replacing as much of that gray infrastructure with green infrastructure. It's also a win-win proposition. So again, I mentioned it can be more expensive to develop this type of infrastructure, but it also pays for itself over time. So here, this is also an example from where I used to live in Atlanta, Georgia, in the US. There was an area that was kind of just open fields for a long time. It was called the Old Fourth Ward. And then it got kind of to be a hot area. It gentrified to some degree. There's affordable housing and other things built, but it was much more intensely developed. And flooding became a major issue. And so they preserved the central green space. And what they did was they built this huge park that was completely floodable. So they had this amphitheater here where people frequently get married in front of kind of a water feature. But that, when it rains intensely, is all underwater. It's completely underwater. This bridge, there's a playground nearby. There's even waterproof lighting. It all goes underwater at extreme rainfall and then filters back in and becomes a park again. So it's both a park and a floodable space, and it preserves all of that development nearby from suffering major floods. Preserving the trees I talked about a minute ago helps kind of keep the ground ready to absorb rainwater. But urban trees are really important, especially as our cities become warmer and warmer over time. Not every city will get warmer with climate change, but we can expect Auckland to be warmer. We can expect a number of global cities will likely be warmer. So what we try to do is plant these trees and preserve the space to reduce what we call the urban heat island effect. So all this pavement just sucks up heat, right? It repels water and absorbs heat, the two opposite things we want to happen in an urban space. But the trees have this remarkable ability to not just provide shade, but also as the kind of water evaporates from the trees, as they breathe out oxygen, it cools the space. Surface and a surface that's surrounded by trees can be quite significant in difference, right? So it makes it a place that's not just more pleasant to live, but then you can do things like encourage people to walk or cycle because it's not so hot in that space. Once it gets above a certain temperature, it gets hard to convince people to get outside of their car or wait for a bus. But if we can cool that, that's an important step, right? And all of these things are kind of implementable at multiple scales. So we have the household scale, and I'll show you some examples of that in just a second, but things as simple as replacing lawns with more native plantings. So native plants are much more adept at absorbing lots of water and then releasing it when necessary. They're used to this kind of environment. Grass is not particularly good at anything, but requiring a lot of work. So if you can replace it, that's always a huge boon. Help your neighbors as well. Rainwater tanks are a big benefit as well. So capturing all that water that's just going to fall off your roof and go into the stormwater system anyway, you can use that to water your native plants or your grass if you keep it. Excuse me. And then your driveway, of course, is a major kind of impermeable surface. So water just rolls off of that. As much as you can replace that surface with gravel or even things like kind of these pavers that have no center and plants in between, that can reduce a lot of that stormwater as well. So things that they're not free, but they kind of pay for themselves over time. At the community level, community gardens are a big boon that preserves green space, also provides food for the neighborhood and a community space, more tree plantings at the community scale. And then at the government scale, again, permeable surfaces with tree plantings, rooftop gardens, and wetlands that have been preserved and can be used as park space are all big kind of sponge city concepts that work together. And all of these things really have to happen together. We can't just have people putting in a rainwater tank. That's not going to solve the problem. They have to really be implemented at every scale to make this really effective. So here's some things that are effective around Auckland. Hobsonville Point. Does anybody live near Hobsonville Point? We're a little ways away from there, but so most people have pointed to the fact that they didn't suffer much flooding in Hobsonville. And part of that is some of the things they built. So instead of just having they do have stormwater catch basins or grates that often will fill up with leaves and things like that. But in addition to that, they also have these kind of bioretention areas. So stormwater rolls off the street and into these plantings. These plantings have gravel at the bottom, and they're right above the main stormwater drain pipes, and they have plants inside. So they will fill up with water until they can't hold anymore, and then slowly let that water filter into the drainage system, the stormwater system, and wash out to the sea. So it slows down that rainwater. Every house in Hobsonville Point is required by council to have a rainwater tank. And so that retains a significant amount of water. And then there's a lot of wetland preservation. Something like 10,000 native plants have been planted in Hobsonville Point, and a lot of the wetlands have been preserved. And I'll show you kind of images of what that looks like through the development to make these cool urban spaces. As a result, during the Aquanet floods, there's very little flooding in this area, even though neighbors did flood. So 2004 is really when Hobsonville Point development started to kick off. I highlighted in blue all the areas that are kind of wetlands to some degree, or had a significant amount of trees or plants. And you can see how the development over time is 2007, 2009. You'll see the development start to really take shape, 2012, 2015, And you can see how it's pretty mindful of the areas that would be prone to flooding and do help mitigate that flood risk. 2017, 2019, 2022. And you can see by 2022 that all of that space, and it's hard to see now, but you can see trees under there, have all been preserved. And so that's a significant portion. They kind of took every scale of that movement from techno to eco solutions to heart, and that helped really reduce the risk of flooding. Anybody familiar with stone fields? Yeah. So this is stone fields in 2005. Not much to look at, right? Kind of mined out for stone. And so when the development was going in, there was kind of this natural catch basin here, or wetland, you can call it that, for where all the water ran off the site. And so when the development was being put together, planned, and developed, that area was preserved. And as a result, during the Auckland Day floods, it's used as a floodable park. So there are things to walk around and interesting things to do. Water is usually here at some point, but then it's allowed to flood. So it's no longer a park space, but it does retain all that water. And as a result, typically, the housing units there and businesses do not flood, or are less likely to flood. Okay? And at a much larger scale, there's the Yanyazao Park in China. So this is not too far from Wuhan. And it's at the confluence of 4 rivers, an area that frequently floods. And this entire huge city was really only developed in the last 20 years, so massive amounts of development. And so what they did is preserve this wetland. They turned it into kind of a park, but it's a floodable park, so the walking infrastructure, the way to cross the river is pretty high up, but everything else can just be flooded, and that's all right. And then when the floodwater goes down, it's okay. It just returns to its own parkland. So it's a way in which the city has worked with nature and not tried to fight it. Some cities may have tried to build walls or levees to try to control the river. They just allowed the river to flood when it floods, and still have usable infrastructure. In Seoul, South Korea, there's the Cheongnaechon River. It was a long time ago, culverted and then paved over. Essentially, they built a multi-lane highway right over the top of the river for years and years, and they finally decided to daylight the river. That's taking it out of the culvert and let it be somewhat of a natural space. And so they took away almost 12 kilometers of the highway and brought back the river. They built out the banks a little bit, as much as they could, created really different spaces. So this is one gathering space. There's others that looks more like a natural, there's a lot of plantings and other things in the way there. And it's become a really huge focal point for the city. And it also reduces flood. So this, right now the water flows because they actually have pumps that run the water through, but when storms are coming, they shut down the pumps and it just acts as a river and carries that water away, and they don't see the flooding that they used to when they had a giant impermeable surface. And even on a bigger scale, cities like Singapore, which when we had the Auckland Day floods, we recorded over 200 millimeters of rain in a 24-hour period. That's fairly frequent in Singapore to happen on an annual basis. In the 1970s, it would flood fairly regularly, and since that time, they've taken a lot of approaches that try to intensify development within the city and preserve wetlands and make floodable parks and things like that. And they haven't suffered a significant flood since the 1990s. As a result of embracing these kinds of approaches at the local and citywide level. So it can be done. It takes some effort. No city's going to be perfect. I think the rainwater gauges that have been, or meters have been recovered from Hawke's Bay are showing something like 450 millimeters in 12 hours. So just a massive amount of water you wouldn't be able to retain even with this. But you can certainly mitigate its, reduce its effects and not see the kind of devastation that we're seeing now. Okay. I think that's it for me.
much, Tim. Time for a question.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of debate about the light rail and whether we get to underground it and stop the disruption of business.
Yeah.
Either underground it would be cheaper and free up money for the future. So are you arguing that underground is better?
Yeah, I mean, I've been vocal on the news a few times that I think it shouldn't be underground. It's an extreme high cost, and it goes back to that idea of over-engineering things or overthinking it. It would be the only system in the world that has any underground component. No other light rail system in the world has that. It would also be the most expensive per kilometer light rail project in the world ever. So bringing it above ground would have kind of a lot of benefits. We could make a bigger system. We could do things like green tracking, which would help with our stormwater plan, and we could reduce the cost of other stormwater infrastructure that we may have to develop as a result of kind of more cement and more lanes of road by using just this one piece of infrastructure to help mitigate that. So yeah, I think above ground would probably be the idea in this case.
I'll ask another question about above ground. If you live in the UK, trains are always delayed because there's leaks on the track.
Yeah.
So how does your greening the light rail track work?
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I guess not planting as many deciduous trees near the track is important. I like in Lyon, France, sorry. They've had a green track light rail system there for 30-ish years, and it's pretty reliable. And there's other examples around the world. So I don't know specifically how to solve that one issue, but typically the example we've seen around the world, the above ground systems can be pretty reliable. There's also a matter of getting cars out of the way of light rail systems so that they're not being blocked. So there's other issues that do happen, but from an infrastructure point of view, it can be a benefit.
Another question here at the back.
What are the best low-lying shrubs that can absorb water to grow on a steep hillside that's actually had a landslide?
Yeah.
What would you suggest? Like, I've been told the old adaptations are great, but of course councils
yeah.
I just experienced a terrible landslide.
Yeah.
Fortunately, the houses are intact, and I need to know what to grow on this steep landslide now. Tall trees will probably eventually just come over. Like I know from the tower are great, and there are potatoes that are slow. But yeah, can you suggest it?
No, I mean, I don't have a good answer for that. It's a little bit outside of my expertise. I know we should be planting things on hillsides where we can, and maybe not building so close to them as well, but in terms of what to plant, someone else might know.
Start by planting natives, which know the place.
Natives on the hillside.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying that natives will never be destroyed in these slips.
Yeah.
But they tend to survive much better than panthers and ghouls and all the invasive weeds that we get, which are preventing the growth of native plants anyway.
And cabbage trees, which have a deep root compared to their height, and if they are pushed over, they just keep growing.
Yes.
It's not the only species, but it's they're fast growing too.
Also on the History White Hackney Rangers Alliance Facebook page, I did put up a paper that someone had done quite a while ago, perhaps 20 years ago, and they just looked at 10 riparians, so plants that we plant on the stream side, but often that's about we're trying to stabilise the banks. And I noticed, I think, tutu, which if you've got stock and bees, maybe not, but lemonwood, so Pittosporum eugenoides, Pittosporum tenuifolium, so that's called hoo-hoo. Certainly the cabbage tree. Yeah, but some people are going, because,
Very, very poisonous.
yes, it's
So-
poisonous.
Only sometimes is it poisonous.
But you know, no one's on the bank. Just saying.
All right,
Yeah.
interesting discussion, but we have a list of speakers to get through. Yvonne, one last question.
Yeah, Peter, what I'm saying, before, I go back in the old days ago, the council used to put out booklets and pamphlets that contained all that information.
Yeah.
What to plant
Plant me instead.
on your
Remember
property, what kind of trees and everything. And they have, but not to the extent that they were done. And it was available to the public. I've got this kind of property, what do I plant? The information was there. And it's the same thing as you talk about budget. Hey, let's look after what's important, and that's our environment.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Tim, very much.